Australia has joined a growing list of economies in recession as the coronavirus pandemic hammers demand for goods and services. After contracting by 0.3% in the first quarter, the country's GDP registered its sharpest contraction ever between April and June.
Today's national accounts confirm the devastating impact on the Australian economy from COVID-19. Our record run of 28 consecutive years of economic growth has now officially come to an end. The cause? A once-in-a-century pandemic. The effect? A COVID-19 induced recession. Real GDP fell in the June quarter by 7%, the largest quarterly fall on record. Since the series began in 1959, this is its largest ever fall.
Lockdowns to limit the spread of COVID-19 slammed the logistics sector, and spending on transport fell by 80%. The hospitality industry has been battered as spending on restaurants and hotels fell by 60%. And overall household spending was down more than 12% in the second quarter. To encourage a recovery, the government has spent more than $213 billion so far, including $105 billion in subsidized loans for businesses. And it's promising more support to get the economy going again.
Australia will not resign to this virus, Mr. Speaker, and our economy will not resign to this virus. Mr. Speaker, what we will do is to continue to believe in Australians and their resilience and their enterprise. We will build, Mr. Speaker. We will make it easier for businesses to employ and to invest and to get Australians back into jobs as they lead the recovery.
Economists say the government would do better to spend its money on cash handouts and infrastructure instead of cheaper credit for a quick boost to the economy.
In the final quarter of the year, beyond that September when the supports are eased off, what we're going to see is a contraction from government stepping back if they don't announce significant changes in the October budget, and that remains to be seen. There will be a big pullback in terms of government support, so that's another danger zone for the economy that final 3 months of the year.
As consumers cut back on their spending, household savings climbed to nearly $60 billion by the end of June, compared to $42 billion in the same month last year. The central bank is expected to lower interest rates to encourage spending, but analysts say most Australians are unlikely to change their frugal ways until the pandemic passes. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, Paul Frijters joins us now from London. He's an economist and visiting professor of Wellbeing Economics at the London School of Economics. Well, looking at the Australian situation, we know that Australia was one of the few developed economies that escaped the 2008 financial crisis without plunging into a recession. This time it seems like the twin disasters of the bushfires and the pandemic has finally broken that 28-year winning streak, hasn't it?
It definitely has, yes. It's been a terrible time for Australian businesses and lots of Australian workers, essentially quite a few million of which are at home with not much to do.
That's right. Now, in terms of the severity of this quarterly plunge, 7% in the last quarter, the worst on record in Australia. But it could have been worse, couldn't it? Because other economies such as the US fell about 9.5% in the same quarter. The UK economy plunged 20%. What helped prop up the Australian economy during this period?
I think there are a couple of factors. One factor is that the mining sector never really plunged, so exports in several of the months are actually up. Another factor was that Australia for a while in that quarter was not in the full lockdown that some of the other countries was. So they had a first wave of lockdowns, then they declared victory against the virus, which is of course very premature. But that allowed a partial rebound. And part of the problem they have going forward is that COVID has re-emerged in that country as a problem, and the southern state of Victoria has instigated a huge lockdown, which will mean quite another knock to GDP coming in the third and the fourth quarter. So that over the year as a whole, it really is looking disastrous for Australia.
Now, in many cases, I think a lot of people are hoping for this so-called V-shaped recovery where a deep plunge in GDP is followed by a quick recovery. Do you believe then that the worst is over for the Australian economy, that it will experience a quick recovery?
I think in the coming 3 to 4 months, no, because they keep having these very severe lockdowns, and also they've entered a very unfortunate political cycle whereby the states are outdoing each other in being nasty towards each other. So they've closed borders against each other. So, for instance, the Northern Territories have said they might not let Victorians, which is another part of Australia, in for the next 18 months, which of course, completely kills the trade and the tourism and the business between those individual states. So in an economic sense, Australia is slightly unraveling at the moment, and this is a great problem for the central government in Canberra. Now, in the long run, Australia has a lot going for it, but it will experience a further deepening, I think, of the recession. And then, yes, there will be a recovery, but nowhere near as quick as the downturn. I mean, there's one thing we know about recoveries, which is that it takes a lot longer to reconstitute jobs and businesses than that it takes to destroy them.
Now, as you pointed out, the plunge could have been worse were it not for Australia's robust mining sector. We know China was buying up iron ore throughout this period, pretty much as it was before the pandemic. But we know that relations between China and Australia are also deteriorating over things like Huawei and other geopolitical issues. Do you believe that China will still remain one of Australia's top customers?
It will remain one of the top customers, mainly because it is so far ahead of the second customer and the third customer. And so it'll take a while before it gets knocked off its perch. But already two of the major linkages between China and Australia are effectively broken. So Chinese tourists have effectively not come this season to Australia, and they don't look likely to return as the Chinese government is making more and more adversarial noises against Australia and advising many of their population not to go to Australia. Also, the student industry and a lot of the purchases that Chinese business made in Australia for Australian properties, houses, forms of tax evasion, if you like, that is slowly coming to an end too. So the new influx of students should not be expected to have too many Chinese in it. And then what remains is agriculture and mining. And mining is still relatively going strong, but is of course very subject to political tensions, which are still heating up because geopolitically Australia is in the American camp, and that sort of emerging Cold War is having major repercussions for the Australian-Chinese relationship.
It sure is. Okay, Professor Paul Frijters from the London School of Economics, thank you again for joining us on the program.